Hi. In this lecture, what I would like to do is to provide an introduction to the way in which you can access different components of the Chrome browser developer tools. This is the kind of information that you'll need in order to begin a journey into web application programming. My name is Professor J Patterson. The Chrome browser provides lots of information for understanding what a web page is doing. And to be clear, all the other major browsers do as well. But today, for this lecture, we're just going to focus on how to do this in the Chrome browser. But you should be aware that other browsers, Safari, Edge, Firefox, all provide the same kinds of underlying support for developers. The first thing that you might be interested in is you might be interested in seeing what information is coming back from a server when you make a request for a URL or an internationalized URL. And the problem here is that when you, as a client in your browser, request a web page, sometimes it's hard to see the raw data that's being returned by the server from your browser. And so the solution to this is to use a feature of a browser called View Source. And this will enable you to see the contents of what was returned by the browser. This is what that looks like. So if we start in a Chrome browser window and we go to a page at the California Department of Motor Vehicles, we might be interested in seeing the underlying HTML. To do that, you go under View and Developer and View Source, and the Chrome browser, rather than rendering the contents of the web page as a web page, will show you the contents of the web page in its original HTML form. You'll see all the tags and all the sources associated with the tags, the structure and the content of the web page. This is the information that has been returned from the server before the browser has done any processing or evaluation of the content. Very raw. This kind of view is very helpful if you're controlling the server and aren't sure if you're giving the right thing back to the browser. So this is a good way to test whether or not your server is giving the information that you expect it to be giving to clients. A second thing that's difficult to view when you are working with a client-server architecture, it's hard to know what the browser is doing when it renders the data that is returned from an IRI or internationalized URL request. So to get a lot more information about what the browser is doing, you can look at the developer tools that are located in Chrome. You can either do that, for example, here on the California DMV webpage, by going under View and Developer Tools, again, that's View Source, or you can right-click and choose Inspect. Either one will open up a page of information about the inner workings of the browser. By using the dot menu, you can select where on the layout that information is placed, just for convenience, based on the size of your web page. In addition to going under View and Developer Tools, you can get that same information by right-clicking and selecting Inspect. When you hover over different components listed in the Elements tab, it will show you which components in the web page are associated with that component of the elements by highlighting it in the rendered view on the left. Well, as you work in developing web applications, it's interesting to be able to see how your web content would be presented on different devices and in different screen orientations. You can use the developer tools in order to do that, and this is very useful for doing UI testing. So in order to get access to that, again, you start with the developer tools, perhaps by right-clicking and doing Inspect, or by going under View and Developer Tools. From here, you have the opportunity of laying out your web page however you'd like, and selecting the small button at the top that looks like a little mobile phone. You can then select from the drop-down menu a variety of different commercial phone hardware that's available, and the Chrome browser will re-render the content of the web page based on the size of the device. You can then rotate it using the rotating button and look at the landscape view or the portrait view. In the responsive view, you can set arbitrary sizes for your screen if your particular commercial hardware isn't viewable. You can zoom in or zoom out using a percentage scale. That's not changing the device, it's just for your particular screen so you can see it. And then an interesting thing you can do as well is you can set the apparent network speed that this device is experiencing. You can set throttling. Are you working on a high-speed or low-speed network? Sometimes this is interesting for evaluating how long it takes for very large graphics or animated effects to work on your device. Again, you can choose your hardware size by choosing from the drop-down menu. If you choose responsive from the drop-down menu, you can drag and drop an arbitrary size. You can control how much it's zoomed in or zoomed out, and you control the amount of what the apparent network speed is to the device that you're viewing over on the left. All of this is accessed through the little button to the left of the Elements tab selector that looks like a small mobile phone in front of a tablet. When your web page is being rendered, it may encounter errors. That could be caused by resources not being available. It could be caused by badly formed IRIs or URLs. It could be caused by errors in your JavaScript or your HTML. All of these things will show up as errors. And you can view those errors. Instead of looking at the Elements tab, you can look at the Console tab. There's also a place where you can look at all of the different components that are present within a website. And you can look at all of those components organized by their domain name and path name by looking under the Sources tab. Finally, you can get a very detailed report of the network performance of your web page, the order in which all of the resources were requested, and how much time it took by looking in the Network tab. To get a fresh view of this, you have to make sure that you have disabled the cache. Otherwise, you're going to see results that are dependent on a cache, and that cache may look different for different people. And so you may not be getting the user experience of the network if you have cache enabled. So let's take a look at what that would look like. Let's go to my homepage, www.djp3.net. And let's open up the browser tools by selecting Inspect, right-clicking and selecting Inspect. From here, you can see that the browser tab has Elements selected, and as I highlight different portions, those portions of the web page are highlighted on the left. That red icon indicates that 4 errors are present, and by clicking on Console, you can see the nature of them. All of these seem to be related to some advertising information that my hosting provider is placing into my website. It appears that the ad resources are not able to be located. By selecting the Sources tab, you can see all of the components of my website that come from other domains organized by domain. Many of them are on the djp3.net server, and you can drill down into the different file hierarchies and select the images or JavaScript components that were loaded in order to make my website activate. A total of, I believe on this one, a total of 133 different resources had to be loaded from the internet in order for my web page to render. Finally, under the Network tab, you can make sure that you have Disable Cache checked, and you can see that there's no throttling set. When you reload the page, you'll get detailed information about all the resources that were loaded from top to bottom. The first one being the HTML associated with www.djp3.net. Now, after I loaded this, I got a simple preview of what that web page would look like before all the other resources were brought in. And you can select that resource and then select Preview. You can look at some other items like what the server responded with specifically and how much time it took to get this resource, and very detailed granularity. For example, how long the DNS lookup took, how long it took to send the request, and how much time it took to actually transfer the request back. As you go down, you can see resources that were required later. For example, this picture of me that was delivered after the basic index.html was loaded. You can see as well the time it took for that. You can see there's a lot of JavaScript, a lot of images, a lot of things associated with what looks like analytics. Looks like there's something from DoubleClick in there as well. Each one of those components can be selected. You can look at a preview. You can look at what the server sent, and a lot of details about all the process that was involved in delivering that resource. Now again, by looking down at the bottom, you can see that 133 different requests were made for resources in order to build that entire web page, even though that initial process was just started by requesting www.djp3.net. Finally, probably the most sophisticated thing that you can do with a web page is you can profile it. What profiling does is it keeps track of how much CPU resources the browser is using while it is loading your web page, and it just keeps track of it and it counts how much time is spent on different aspects of loading your web page. This enables you to get a very clear breakdown of what's taking your web page a long time to render. This is called profiling. And in order to do this, you have to go to the Performance tab, and you actually have to record a session of working with your website. You can either record that session and then hit stop, or you can hit the refresh button and just profile one particular load of your web page. Let's take a look at what that would look like on my homepage, djp3.net. We'll open the Inspect tab, and then we'll go ahead and enter the address in. We'll see that loaded up. We have the Elements tab highlighted, and so as the resource loads, we'll see that come in. You can see the Network tab. In real time, you can see that resources arriving. And then finally, by using our little expansion arrows there, we can get to the Profiling tab. Here's the Record button. You would select this to do an arbitrary record, but what we're interested in is profiling one particular page load. So we're going to hit the Refresh button to capture the statistics from one load. Takes a little while to do this profiling. All the resources are loaded. The JavaScript is executed. Slower than a normal page load, but it gives you the details you're looking for. After it processes what comes back, you get a very detailed timeline of all the different work that the browser had to do along the way. And this donut chart at the bottom gives you a kind of zeitgeist for what happened. And you can see that the majority of the time down here was spent by the system doing some kind of system work there, 5.107 seconds. A good chunk of the time was spent idle, probably while the web browser was waiting for the server to deliver the content back. But those colored parts represent different kinds of computation that the browser had to do to render my page. It spent some time loading the contents, that was the blue chunk. Spent some time running JavaScript, that's the yellow part. Spent some time rendering my images, so composing them and drawing the particular graphics. And then finally, it spent a little bit of time actually putting those graphics onto the browser. That's called painting. And so in this particular case, you can see that, oh, of the things that I can control, it looks like maybe the scripting was the thing that took the most time. So if I were to reduce the amount of JavaScript that was in this web page, I could make my web page load faster. There are also a lot of resources in this web page, 133 as we saw previously. So maybe reducing the number of resources that are required would reduce the amount of idle time that is required while we're waiting for the network to respond. So the key points here. The Chrome browser provides a lot of interesting details about the process of loading and running a web page. This is critical information for developers of web applications and people who are debugging problematic web applications or network connections. For example, you can see what was obtained when you requested a URL from a server, and do this with the view source function. You can look to see what this content would look like in different sized browsers, including mobile platforms. You can do that in the developer tools. You can look to see what other URLs were loaded in addition to the initial request that you made. For example, although I initially requested www.djp3.net, in order to render that web page, the browser had to request 133 other resources. You can look to see how much time it took, both in terms of the network time to collect those resources or in terms of the CPU time to render and process those resources. And overall, you can get a pretty good sense of why did it take so much time for my web page to load. There is an enormous amount of complexity in a modern browser, and being able to have access to some of the tools is a great resource for web developers and web application designers. As you are working through user experience and user interface design problems, this is a great way to understand some of the complexity that's involved. Thank you for your attention.